Hi, bio folks. This is Mrs. Ness-Deden, and today we're going to continue talking about the process of cellular respiration. You learned basically how this works yesterday. Today we're going to review that a little and then talk about a slight variation on it. So as we talked about yesterday, all living things have to do cellular respiration to make ATP, that molecule that acts as a battery and provides energy for living things. Some organisms can do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, like plants. And so the example that you see on your screen is drawn as a plant leaf, just to remind you that both of these processes happen within a plant. So the way that plants get their energy, they originally get their energy from the sun, and then they also take in the other reactants that they need for photosynthesis. They take in the carbon dioxide from the air and the water from their roots, and use those in the chloroplast, in that organelle, to do the process of photosynthesis. The purpose of photosynthesis, of course, is to produce glucose. That's the product that contains that energy. So the energy from sunlight is locked away in the bonds of that glucose. It also produced some oxygen as kind of a waste product. The cool thing about plants is then they take that glucose that they produced and immediately use it as a reactant for cellular respiration. So it literally just kind of floats through the plant cell into this next chemical pathway. So this is now the beginning of cellular respiration. The first thing that happens in cellular respiration is that the glucose molecule, even before it gets into the mitochondria, when it's just floating through what's called the cytoplasm, kind of the liquid that fills the cell, is that glucose molecule gets broken in half. So that process is called glycolysis. That literally means breaking sugar. So it gets broken into these two kind of half glucose molecules. And that first step, that process, produces two molecules of ATP. And that's before we even get into the mitochondria, that powerhouse of the cell. Those half glucose molecules then, those are called pyruvate, they move into the mitochondria, where that process of aerobic cellular respiration takes place. Aerobic means with oxygen. So there's a series of chemical reactions in here that continue to break down and break down and break down that pyruvate. And eventually they use oxygen, the other reactant of respiration, to produce water and carbon dioxide as kind of the products that come out. But of course, the most important product and the purpose of this whole thing is the ATP that's made. And the reason they call the mitochondria the powerhouse is that this part produces the most ATP. There's 36 molecules of ATP that are produced for every one molecule of glucose broken down. And so total, aerobic respiration, that whole process of taking a glucose molecule and breaking it down, produces about 38 molecules of ATP for every glucose molecule. So it's a very efficient way to make energy. But sometimes there isn't any oxygen available. And that's the part we're going to talk about today. If there's no oxygen available for the mitochondria to use, none of this half, nothing in the mitochondria can function. All those chemical reactions within the mitochondria rely on oxygen. So without oxygen, this whole pathway kind of backs up. And the only part that can still happen is that first step, that glycolysis step that happens in the cytoplasm and breaks the glucose in half. Once that has happened, then you end up with all these half glucose molecules floating around the cell. And so some other chemical reactions kind of continue this process so that cells can continue to make energy. This doesn't make nearly as much energy. Only 2 ATP molecules are made every time you break a glucose in half, but at least the cell is making some energy, and some is better than none. It's enough to kind of keep things working until maybe there's oxygen available some other time in the future. So these processes that kind of take over when there's not oxygen available are called anaerobic respiration or fermentation. Those are two terms that mean basically the same thing. They're reactions that break down the pyruvate, those half glucose molecules, that allow energy production to continue. There are a couple of different ways that this can happen, and we're actually going to look at some demonstrations that show you how different types of fermentation work, and talk a little bit about some of the byproducts, some of the waste products that are made as a result of this. I'm going to move the camera and kind of make the video a little bigger so that you can watch a couple of demonstrations here. So hang on just a minute as I readjust a little. Okay, the first demonstration is one that you can try at home. Grab a textbook if you got one, grab something kind of that weighs a little bit, stand up, put it flat on your palm, and just hold it straight up to the side. And keep it there for as long as you can. Our cells normally perform aerobic cellular respiration, which means we use oxygen. That's why we're breathing all the time. If you're doing aerobic exercise, you breathe faster, so your cells have enough oxygen. But after a while, like right about now, because my arm's starting to hurt, you can maybe see the book starting to shake over there a little bit. My muscle cells are working so hard that they're starting to run out of oxygen. And so my muscles start to switch from aerobic respiration to anaerobic respiration. As they do that, it manages to continue producing energy for my cells so that we can keep holding the book up for a little bit longer. This is kind of an emergency backup system, though. It's not the best way, and it's certainly starting to make my muscles hurt quite a lot, so I'm going to stop now. When that happens, there's a byproduct that's produced in your muscles. And this may be something that you've heard of before. The byproduct is called lactic acid. And lactic acid is a waste product. Our cells don't need it, but in order to keep these chemical reactions happening, it starts to build up in your muscles as a waste product. And your cells then will need to get rid of that lactic acid eventually. And that's why a lot of times after you've been lifting weights or doing some kind of exercise, it actually helps your muscle feel better if you go for a walk or go for a jog and do some aerobic respiration to help kind of clear out that lactic acid. There are other types of anaerobic respiration or fermentation that are done by other types of living things. Lactic acid fermentation is the type that animals like humans do. Now we're going to look at another demonstration that'll show you a different type of fermentation that's done by some types of bacteria and also by yeast cells. So I'm going to move the camera once more so that you can see me set up this demonstration, and then we'll talk about what's happening there. All right, so here I have two flasks. I'm going to put some water in the first one. This one's kind of just going to serve as our control here. And so I'm going to fill this up to about 100 milliliters with water. The second one, I'm going to fill with grape juice. And I'm only using grape juice because it's the type of juice that I had at home. This would work equally well with apple juice or orange juice or anything like that. So we're going to put some juice in there. Now I'm going to add a spoonful of yeast to each of these flasks. Yeast, when you buy it from the store, just looks like a dry powder like this. You've probably seen that if you've ever baked bread or anything, but these are actually alive. They're just in a dormant state right now. And so when we put them in water and give them the things that they need, they will kind of wake up and they will start doing some cellular respiration. So I'm going to add a spoonful, a roughly level spoonful to each. So there's some in the water and a spoonful here in the juice. And then I'm just going to shake them up a little bit so that all of the yeast are down in the liquid. Give that one a little bit of a shake. Give that one a little bit of a shake. And so as these yeast wake up, they're starting to do their cellular respiration. And just so that we can see what types of things they're producing, as you've noticed with many of these processes, at least one of the things that's produced, one of the products, is a gas. And so I'm going to put a balloon over the top of each of these. And these are mostly empty. I'll try and let all the air out of that one. There we go. So that we can capture any of the gases that are released. When we first do this, we're trapping some air in there with the yeast, right? So the air that's in there is the same as the air in the room. And right now that air does contain oxygen. So I want you to think about what's happening in here. You're going to answer a couple questions and then make some predictions about what's going to happen here based on what you've already learned about anaerobic respiration, this process of fermentation. So now I'm going to switch these out. I have a couple of these flasks that I started about an hour and a half ago. So they've had a little bit of time to sit, but I set them up exactly the way that I just showed you. So I'll move those two out of the way. Here are the ones that have been there for about an hour and a half. So you can see this one is the one that had water, and this is the one that has the juice in it. Make some observations about what you see happening here. The juice is an important part of this because it contains sugar, and one of the reactants that's necessary for any kind of respiration is sugar. You can see the one that was just in water hardly did anything. There's not really anything that happened. The balloon's still just floppy there. They were not able to perform any respiration because they didn't have that reactant. They didn't have any glucose. They didn't have any sugar. There's plenty of sugar in the juice. And so you can see these yeast woke up and started respirating a whole bunch. You can see how frothy and bubbly it is here at the top. And as they started to do that process, they started to release carbon dioxide, which inflated the balloon. carry out this fermentation though, the chemical process that they use is a little bit different. The byproduct that they create is not lactic acid. They create a different waste product. They produce some alcohol. And this process actually won't continue forever. If we leave these yeast in here for too long, the alcohol will actually build up enough to become toxic to them. Alcohol is a poison, and so it will eventually actually kill the yeast cells in there. So this isn't the best way for them to make energy, but it's better than nothing, and it's a way to keep them alive when they aren't able to do aerobic respiration with oxygen available to them. We're going to talk just a little more and kind of review these processes a little more before we wrap up today. So I'll move the camera back and be right back. All right, so this slide kind of summarizes these two respiration pathways again. All of them start with this idea of glycolysis, this first step that happens out in the cytoplasm and creates a little bit of ATP. From there, whichever pathway follows next depends on whether there's oxygen present or not. If oxygen is present, then these next couple steps happen. You don't need to know the names of those, but the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation are that process of aerobic respiration that occurs in the mitochondria. So then we go into aerobic respiration. That powerhouse of the cell produces 36 ATP, a whole bunch. But if that first step happens and there's no oxygen available, then the mitochondria doesn't function. So then we move to fermentation, the anaerobic process. Anaerobic means without oxygen. That either produces lactic acid or ethanol, that type of alcohol that was produced by the yeast. And that all happens within the cytoplasm. This last slide kind of demonstrates that same process. First, the glucose is broken in half through glycolysis. That produces 2 ATP molecules. And then again, if there is oxygen, it moves into aerobic cellular respiration in the mitochondria and makes a whole bunch more. But if there's not oxygen, this process of fermentation can happen, which produces some byproducts that cells need to deal with, but it allows them to continue creating ATP and continue performing the processes that cells need to do.